Hey folks, welcome back to part two of session one, talking about comparative quantitative education research methodology. Something that I wanted to just make sure I mention before I move on is that although my name is Alex Wiseman, much of the information that I'm presenting in these slides actually was put together by Slumzinski and Tomescu Dubrow. And I wanted to, I'm just going to take a moment here to show you. This is the guy, right? This is Dr. Slumzinski, who is partially responsible for producing a lot of the content that I'm explaining. Now, when he presented it or put together this information, I think it was more related to talking about cross-national studies. A really smart and interesting and important person in the field of cross-national research and methodology. And if you want more information, I put this also on the slides. You can go to this CONCERT, Cross-National Studies Interdisciplinary Research and Training Program webpage. You can find more information there. And I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge that the information that I'm using, sort of the outline for the information that I'm using, comes from Slumzinski and Tomescu Dubrow. I'm putting, as you might imagine, a little more of a comparative and international education spin on this. So while the framework or the outline of the content really does belong to them, I'm going to claim a lot of the description and the explanation related to comparative international education quantitative methodology. I'm going to claim it for myself, and for this class. So just so you know that this is coming from a sort of a collaborative effort. I'm definitely standing on the shoulders of giants here. So I would love to take all of the credit, but nothing in this world is original, unfortunately. Anyway, let's get back to comparative methods. So we were talking about comparative methods in our last video right at the end. And I mentioned, I got to put the pointer back on. I mentioned that we were talking specifically about quantitative and that that was going to be the approach that we would use, assuming that the topic that we're studying and the questions that we're asking lend themselves to a quantitative approach. The first thing that comes, obviously, in any research is your issue or your topic or your problem or your phenomenon, and then the research question that you're broadly asking. Now, I will say when you are looking at quantitative versus qualitative, and this is a larger debate than we probably have time for right now, many times we're thinking of an issue of scope or or quite frankly, how much data we need in order to actually address our phenomenon and answer our question. And quantitative is many times the type of data that's relied on, the type of methods that are relied on when you have a lot of data that you want to analyze related to your particular question and topic. That could be at the macro level or the micro level. Certainly lends itself a little more heavily to macro level data than to micro, but I can think of you could collect a lot of information about one person that it would be really helpful to have quantitative data to look at, especially if that is, remember, are across time and looking at longitudinal. If we're looking at a longitudinal study and each of these bars represents a cycle of data collection, but we have one individual, that individual had the wonderful name of Alex in our last video, who has data collected on him at every one of these time points or cycles of data collection. That would be essentially micro level data. I'm using air quotes even though you can't see me. Micro level data about Alex, but the amount of data would be enormous, and you'd want to have a way to address that quantitatively to make the analysis of that data quite frankly more appropriate and within the bounds of what the statistical analysis could say was significant or valid and reliable, etc. Okay, so we're gonna move through these again kind of quickly. So the questions that would be asked always going to be how and why, regardless for me of whether or not we're doing a quantitative or a qualitative. What we generally want to steer away from is the what. I'm going to put an X through that, because what tends to be a little more descriptive, and when we're doing the comparative international education research, we're often trying to explain relationships and phenomena. We're not just trying to say, there were 365 days in the year. What? So we're not just counting, we're doing something more than that. How should the questions be asked? So this is where we talked about using questions that can be empirically measured, and at least the constructs that are in those questions can be empirically measured and quantitatively empirically measured. And so we convert those often into hypotheses, so that they are empirically measurable statements that can be addressed using quantitative data. And so we're going to use the rules of statistics for most of the methods that we're going to approach this way. When we talk about comparative education research, we often start with cross-national research. So that's really why it's called comparative and international education. And again, if you took the Introduction to Comparative International Education course, you've already had a large dose of this kind of theorizing and thinking about what exactly comprises comparative international education versus other kinds. What I suggest, though, that we do, and that's why the slide is also here, is that when we talk about comparative education research, we really are often talking about things that go across nations. And the question then becomes, what are the units of observation in cross-national research? So when we think of nations, we need to know how that's defined. And if we think of, I'm just going to draw a very poor representation of the United States. And then we've got Alaska up here, and we've got Hawaii over here. When we think of the United States, if we were using that as a unit and we're thinking about that, then we're talking about a political state if we're actually following this boundary here. But there are many nations that exist within it, because, for example, I used to work in New Mexico, which is a state that's roughly here, and there is an area right here that is called the Navajo Nation. It is a Native American tribe that has incorporated itself as a nation, and quite frankly always was a nation. So that nation exists within the United States. We have also the idea of countries, which are sometimes coterminous with the political boundaries of the state, although the state is often more specifically defined by the politics and the political system. We have societies that exist within these and across these as well. So, for example, if we wanted to talk about sort of a North American society, we would include sort of Canada with the United States. Mexico has a very different, I'm going out in the ocean here. Mexico has a very different culture in many ways. And so there might be some questions about whether or not that is a society in the same way that Canada and the United States share cultural overlap, although certainly Mexico and Spanish-speaking individuals within communities within the United States are enormous and important and really valid. Again, back to my experience in Oklahoma and New Mexico, very large Spanish-speaking populations, many of whom originally immigrated from Mexico, but we also have from Europe, and we have from Asia, and we have all sorts of societies that are part of the United States. And then if we talk about systems, we can talk about the educational systems, and I'm just going to make a grid here so it looks even more realistic in terms of representing how complicated it is. There are roughly 16,000 independent school districts within the United States. And I'll make them in Alaska as well, although they'd be bigger up there in Hawaii. I'm probably just one per island, I'm guessing. I don't know the system there. But you get what I'm saying. So there are lots of different ways that we can understand the units of observation for comparative education. And just in looking at one country, the United States, we've covered nation states, countries, societies, and systems. So it's kind of a jumbled mess in some ways. So understanding how we're going to define each of those is going to be incredibly important. So for nations, Since the late 18th century, the idea of nation assumed a fundamental political significance within the rise of the ideology of nationalism. If any of you have read Benedict Anderson's, I'm going to write his name out here, Anderson's book, Imagined Communities. Sorry, writing over things, communities. You'll see a very well-known and popularly used definition of a political state that is given in that. It's very popular within sociological and anthropological analyses. And at least that's where I'm most familiar with it. There are certainly many other ways that we can define what the nation is, but that's a good place to start. Nations, since the 18th century, though, have been regarded as unique entities that are comprised of people who are entitled to sovereignty, the big part of Benedict Anderson's point, because of several characteristics. They often have a common ethnic origin. They often share, as a result of that, a common language, culture, religion, and then they self-identify in a way that brings them together under the banner of that nation. Nation states, however, change things quite a bit, or maybe not quite a bit, a little bit. So, as is pointed out here by Slemzinski and his colleague, all criteria to distinguish nations are in dispute. However, in the 20th century, an ideology of nation states came into existence with more and more emphasis on the state part. And the state part has two types of senses or ways of defining it: an empirical or de facto one, and a juridical or de jure sense. So de facto means in fact, right, or because of the fact. An entity is a state if it's organized on a specific territory that has a monopoly on legitimate violence over this territory, defending the social order externally and internally. So it acts like a state, and therefore it is a state. De jure means an entity is a state if it's recognized as such by other states. So this has more to do with legitimacy and expectations. So international law and international organizations, for example, the United Nations, will recognize particular entities as states or nations as political states, and that gives them these states then the ability to be defined as nation states because they have that recognition and that legitimacy that comes from the recognition. So we could have, let's think of some examples here. We could have nation states where we're talking about the correspondence between the nation and the state. So what might be nation states? This is something for us to examine in class, and maybe this is a question I will bring to you when we meet together. If you could think of two nation states and give example 1 and example 2 that we could talk about, and then an example 1 and 2 of nations without states or stateless people. I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you one example. Would be the Roma population. The Roma population exists across many different countries, particularly in Europe and Eastern Europe, even more so than other areas. This is a traditionally disenfranchised, a marginalized nation, a group of people. They're completely stateless. There is no state that is set aside for the Roma peoples. And as a result, there aren't particular laws, structures, systems, organizations, policies, etc. that are determined by the Roma nation for its people. They are usually subject to the laws, conditions, and systems of whatever state they are in at the time, even though the nation itself roams across many different borders. This is also the way I mentioned the Navajo earlier. So the Navajo are not necessarily stateless anymore, but in earlier part of the United States history, the Navajo and other Native American nations were not recognized. They did not have the de jure legitimacy that they have now, and they did not have the de facto legitimacy because